The town gathered to watch a man sold like cattle, but one widow's voice cut through the dust and silence, changing everything. In Dry Creek, the sheriff put a shackled native prisoner on the auction block, his fate sealed by the highest bidder. But when Clara Whitford stepped forward with her last $70, she wasn't just buying a man's freedom, she was setting herself against her neighbors, against prejudice, and against the powerful ranchers who wanted her land. Together, she and Samuel would face fire, betrayal, and mobs in the night. What began as an act of mercy would become a story of survival, redemption, and a bond stronger than fear. The dust did not lie. It carried the weight of 100 watching eyes. Dry Creek had seen hangings before, and it had seen auctions. But rarely did it see both dressed up as law. The sun hung mercilessly over the town square, a pale coin in a sky that refused to yield. Heat shimmered above the trampled dirt, where wagons circled close and horses stamped their hooves, as if uneasy with the business at hand. Sheriff McKenna stood with his thumbs hooked into his belt, his badge throwing off a shard of light. Before him, shackled hand and foot, stood Samuel, a broad-shouldered man with dark hair hanging in sweat-soaked strands, his eyes sharp even through exhaustion. To half the crowd, he was no man at all. They called him savage, dangerous. To others, he was just another spectacle, a way to pass a Sunday afternoon before the saloon doors opened. The sheriff's voice cracked like a whip across the murmuring square. By order of the county, this prisoner is put up for auction, $70 to start. The words struck like a hammer. A man's life, opened like a ledger. Bids spat out from the lips of cattlemen, 50, 60, 75. Dale Morrison leaned against a post, smirking, his boots polished, his hand resting easily on his holster. Morrison owned more land than most men could ride in a day, and he liked reminding people of it. 80, he called, just to test the air. The prisoner did not flinch. His chest rose and fell steadily, like a man who had long since stopped expecting mercy. At the edge of the square stood Clara Whitford, widow, 35, a woman with a ranch too small to interest anyone but men like Morrison, who wanted to swallow it up, and a heart too stubborn to quit. Her dress was plain calico, faded by wash and sun, and her hands trembled around the folded bills she had drawn from under her mattress that morning. Her voice cut the air, clear and sudden. 70. Every head turned. Some laughed outright. Others muttered, scandal tightening their throats. A woman bidding? A widow offering her last savings for a man the town called savage? The sheriff blinked, then lifted his chin as if daring her to repeat it. I said 70. She stepped forward, her eyes never leaving Samuel's. McKenna cleared his throat. We've got 80 from Mr. Morrison. Morrison's grin spread slowly. That's right, Sheriff. 80 cash. Best let the widow save her pennies. Clara's jaw tightened. Her hands shook, but her voice did not. 70 is all I've got, and it buys him freedom. I'll not see another cent lined into your pockets for his blood. The murmurs sharpened. Some called her foolish. Others whispered words like disgrace. Yet silence fell when Samuel lifted his head, his eyes locking on Clara's. No gratitude showed, no plea, only a stillness that met her defiance with a weight of its own. The sheriff spat into the dirt. 70 going once, twice. His eyes flicked to Morrison. The rancher's smirk faltered. He hadn't expected a fight like this, not from a woman who could barely hold on to her land. But to outbid her now would mean paying for a man he didn't want, only to spite her. McKenna's hand dropped. Sold. Widow Whitford takes him. The shackles clinked as deputies moved to release Samuel. The crowd's muttering swelled into a low, angry tide. Morrison stepped closer, voice soft but poisonous. You just bought yourself trouble, Clara. Trouble you won't ride out of. She met his stare, her spine rigid. Better trouble bought honest than peace paid for with a lie. Samuel stood free for the first time in months, his wrists raw and marked. He did not step toward her, nor away. The crowd pressed back, uneasy now that law had named him hers. The sheriff shoved the papers at Clara with a sneer. "You'll sign for him then. He's your responsibility." Clara scrawled her name with a hand steadier than she felt. The paper trembled only when she passed it back. Then she turned, meeting Samuel's gaze once more. "My ranch is west, past the creek. You'll come if you choose. If not—" Her words trailed off. She had no right to command him, no claim. Yet something in his silence felt like assent. As they walked away, the townsfolk parted, their whispers trailing like dust. Some spat into the dirt. Others shook their heads. A few, very few, watched with something closer to wonder. By the time Clara reached her wagon, Samuel had fallen into step beside her. Not close, not far, but enough. She clutched the reins, the leather slick in her hands. The gelding shifted under the weight of what had just been done. Samuel spoke at last, his voice low, deep as earth. "You gave all you had." Clara did not glance at him. Her eyes stayed on the road that led west. "Then I expect you'll make it worth the price." For a long while the only sound was the creak of the wagon wheels and the slow crunch of hooves. Behind them, Dry Creek shrank into the heat, its voices fading. But Clara knew the gossip would follow, and she knew Morrison's threat was not empty. Still, she kept her chin high, her heart hammering not with fear but with something fiercer. She had made her choice. Whatever came of it, she would not turn back. Night rode with them, and silence pressed heavier than any chain. The road out of Dry Creek stretched long and bare, nothing but pale dust rising behind the wagon wheels. Clara gripped the reins, urging her gelding onward, though her shoulders ached from the strain. She did not speak. Neither did the man who walked beside the wagon, free but unarmed, carrying nothing but the clothes the jail had left him in. Samuel's stride was steady, deliberate. His eyes scanned the land as if each shadow might rise to test them. Clara felt it too, the weight of unseen eyes, the memory of Morrison's warning still clinging to the air. The crowd had not followed, but whispers had a way of reaching farther than horses. At last, Clara spoke, her voice breaking the stillness. "The ranch isn't much. Fences need mending, roof leaks when it rains. But it's mine." Samuel didn't answer. For a moment, she thought he hadn't heard. Then he said, low, "Better than a cell." They rode in silence again until the sun dipped low. The wagon turned onto a narrow track lined with mesquite, leading toward the Whitford ranch. Once, the house had been proud, a 2-room cabin with a porch, barn, and a few sturdy corrals. Now the boards leaned, shingles peeled, and the fence sagged like tired shoulders. The place looked as worn as its mistress. Clara tied the gelding and lifted her skirts to step down. "It was my husband's," she said quietly. "After the fever took him, it's been just me." She turned, meeting Samuel's gaze head-on. "If you stay, you'll earn your keep. I won't have idlers." He studied her, unreadable. Then, he nodded once. "Work is fair." Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and lavender soap. The hearth still held a faint glow from the morning's fire. Clara moved quickly, pulling bread and beans from the shelf. She set them on the table, acutely aware of the man watching her every motion. When the meal was ready, she placed a plate before him. "Eat." He did, slow at first, as though unsure if the food was meant for him. Then hunger took over, and he cleaned the plate with silent efficiency. Clara ate little, mostly watching. There was no savagery in him, only weariness, the kind born from years of labor and longer years of judgment. After supper, Samuel rose without being asked and carried the dishes to the basin. He washed them carefully, his big hands moving with surprising gentleness. Clara felt a small jolt of something she couldn't name. Gratitude, maybe, or the first stirring of trust. That night, she laid blankets on the floor by the hearth. "You'll sleep there," she said. "Barn leaks too much to keep you dry." He inclined his head. "It will do." Clara retired to her narrow bed in the adjoining room, but sleep did not come quickly. Through the thin wall, she heard the faint shift of Samuel settling onto the floorboards. She thought of his eyes, quiet, watchful, carrying stories he had not told. And she thought of Morrison, whose threats would not rest with nightfall. When morning came, Samuel was already outside. Clara stepped onto the porch to find him lifting the sagging fence rail, testing the wood's strength. He did not ask permission. He simply worked, as if labor were the truest language he knew. By mid-morning, 3 posts stood straighter than they had in years. Clara brought water to the field where he worked. "You've done more in a day than I managed in a month," she admitted. Samuel drank, then handed the dipper back. "A ranch falls easily. Harder to raise it again." His words struck her as more than observation. They carried the weight of experience. She wondered what land he had lost, what fires had taken from him, what chains had broken him. By noon, neighbors began to notice. A wagon creaked along the road, its driver slowing to stare. At the general store, tongues wagged louder than hens. "Widow Whitford brought a savage home," they said. "Bought him like cattle, and now he mends her fences." The gossip reached Clara by evening, when Mrs. Talbot stopped by with a basket of preserves. Her smile was tight, her eyes darting toward the barn where Samuel stacked lumber. "My dear, people are talking," she said in a whisper that carried its own judgment. "Best be careful. A woman's reputation is fragile." Clara's hands tightened around the jar. "So is a man's freedom," she replied. "Yet I don't hear the town whispering over how cheaply it was sold." Mrs. Talbot flushed, muttered a farewell, and hurried away. That night, Clara lit the lamp at the table. Samuel set down a small bundle he had carried with him since leaving the jail. From it, he drew a smooth arrowhead, worn from handling. He placed it on the table between them. "This is all I kept," he said quietly. "It belonged to my father." Clara studied it. Her breath caught. Without thinking, she rose and fetched the Colt revolver from the shelf. The one her husband had carried until the fever claimed him. She set it beside the arrowhead. "This belonged to mine." Their eyes met across the table, the firelight catching both tokens. For a long moment, no words were needed. Respect had passed between them, quiet and unshakable. Outside, the coyotes called to the night. Inside, 2 souls who had known loss shared the smallest ember of trust. The night carried more than wind. It carried warning. By the 3rd day, word had spread beyond Dry Creek's borders. Every rancher, shopkeeper, and preacher with a tongue had something to say about Widow Whitford and the man she'd brought. Home. Some called her desperate. Others whispered about shame. The bolder ones muttered that Morrison was right, that she'd saddled herself with danger she couldn't control. Clara ignored them, at least outwardly. She rose before dawn, baked bread, fed the stock, and carried water until her shoulders burned. Samuel worked from first light, hammering loose shingles back into place, setting new rails in the corral. He moved with tireless precision, every motion purposeful. But Clara saw the way he paused sometimes, scanning the ridge as if expecting shadows to move against them. Late afternoon brought Dale Morrison himself. He arrived on a glossy black stallion, hat tilted, smile fixed sharp as a blade. Clara was mending harness leather on the porch when she heard hooves. Samuel straightened from the corral, jaw tightening. "Afternoon, widow," Morrison drawled, reining in close. "Fine, help you've got there. Though I'd think twice about parading him in plain sight. Folks get ideas." Clara set her stitching aside, meeting his gaze evenly. "What ideas would that be, Mr. Morrison?" "That you've grown tired of running the place alone. That maybe you're seeking company in ways a lady shouldn't. He leaned in the saddle, voice dripping false concern. A woman's name is worth more than any fence post. Best protect it. Samuel's hands curled into fists at his sides, but he held his ground. Clara's heart thudded, though her face remained calm. My name is my own, Mr. Morrison, and this ranch is mine. Neither is for sale. Morrison's smile cracked just enough to reveal his temper. Everything's for sale, Clara. Some folks just don't live long enough to set their own price. He tugged his reins, wheeling the stallion sharply. Dust billowed as he rode off, leaving silence heavy behind him. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Samuel stepped closer. He will come again, he said flatly. I know. She bent back to her stitching, though her hands trembled. But so will morning. That night, the threat proved more than words. Long after Clara had banked the fire and drifted to sleep, Samuel sat awake on the porch, listening. Coyotes yipped in the distance. Then, another sound. Hooves, muffled. A low whistle passed between riders. Shadows moved along the fence line. Samuel rose, quiet as a cat, and slipped into the yard. 5 riders, faces masked with kerchiefs, circled like wolves. Their leader carried a lantern, swinging it low toward the barn. Get a torch, the man hissed. Teach her what happens when folks forget their place. Samuel's blood ran cold, but his hand stayed steady. He stepped from the dark, voice hard as stone. You'll leave. The riders froze. One spat. Savage dog, he snarled. You got no say here. Samuel moved closer, the firelight glinting off his eyes. This land is hers. While I stand, it burns for no man. The leader sneered and raised his torch. In that instant, the cabin door flew open. Clara stood there, Colt revolver leveled with both hands, the lamplight behind her burning fiercely. Drop. It, she said, her voice ringing clear in the night. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The torch crackled, its flame licking higher. Then Samuel stepped forward, wrenched it from the man's grip, and stamped it into the dirt. Smoke hissed up into the night air. The riders shifted, muttering. Without fire, their courage faltered. One pulled at his reins. Another spat again, but softer this time. At last, the leader turned his horse. This ain't over, he growled. The preacher will see to that. The men rode off, their hooves fading into the distance. Clara lowered. The colt, her arms shaking now that the moment had passed. Samuel stood at her side, the scorched remains of the torch smoldering at his feet. You should not have come out, he said quietly, and leave you to face them alone. Her voice was sharp, but her eyes softened. No, Samuel. If they come, they face both of us. For a moment, the night was still again. Samuel studied her, the firelight catching the faint lines of grief and defiance etched into her face. Respect deepened in his chest, heavier than before. Inside, Clara set the colt back on the mantel. She poured water with shaking hands, but steadied herself before she looked up. The town won't stop talking, she murmured. Samuel drank slowly, then placed the cup down. Let them talk. Their words don't mend a roof. Their words don't keep cattle fed. Clara smiled faintly, though it did not reach her eyes. She knew Morrison would be back. She knew Reverend Blackwood's sermons would sharpen into spears, aimed at her door. But for now, they had held the line, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel entirely alone. Morning came with silence too heavy to trust. The sun broke slowly over the horizon, spilling pale light across the ranch. Clara stood at the stove, stirring cornmeal mush with hands that still remembered the tremor of last night's colt. Her eyes flicked toward the window, half expecting riders to appear again, their torches gleaming in the dark. But the yard was still, the fence line empty. Samuel was already outside, shirt sleeves rolled, shoulders bent over the barn roof. He moved like a man who had lived in labor all his life, silent, sure, the weight of the hammer part of his arm. Clara watched from the doorway for a long moment before calling out, "Coffee's on." He looked down, nodded once, and climbed down. At the table, they ate in quiet rhythm, spoon against bowl, steam rising from tin mugs. Clara found herself glancing up more often than she intended, measuring the man across from her. His face was weathered, lined not by age but by endurance. When his eyes lifted, she looked away quickly, heat rushing to her cheeks. The silence pressed. At last, Samuel reached into his pocket and laid the arrowhead on the table again. Its edges glowed faintly in the firelight. "My father carried this," he said. "He said it held memory. That's when the stone breaks. The story ends." Clara set her spoon down. For a heartbeat, words failed her. Then she rose and crossed to the mantel. The Colt revolver gleamed faintly in the morning light. She carried it back and placed it beside the arrowhead. "My husband's," she said quietly. "He swore it kept him alive in Kansas during the border wars. When the fever took him, I thought the gun meant nothing. But it's all I've kept." Their eyes met, tokens between them. It was not a pact, not yet, but something had shifted, as though grief had recognized grief and found company in it. The day stretched long with work. Samuel patched fence rails while Clara carried water from the well, her skirts soaked and heavy by the time the trough was filled. Once, as she stumbled, Samuel was there, steadying her arm, his touch careful as if afraid to overstep. She muttered thanks, brushing it off, but her heart beat too fast for the simple act. In the afternoon, children from the neighboring ranch wandered close, chasing a stray calf. Clara hurried out, scolding lightly, but Samuel was already at the fence. He scooped the bawling calf with practiced ease, guiding it back through the rails. The children stared up at him, wide-eyed, torn between fear and fascination. One whispered, "Ma says you're dangerous." Samuel crouched, setting the calf down gently. "Sometimes people fear what they don't know," he said softly. Then, he reached into his pocket and pulled a small carved bird, whittled from cedar. He placed it in the child's hand. "This is for you." The boy's eyes lit with wonder. Clara's throat tightened as she watched them. When the children ran off, their laughter ringing across the pasture, Samuel returned to the fence, his face unreadable. But Clara saw it, the way giving had softened the hard edges, if only for a breath. That evening, as they shared supper, Clara dared to ask, "You carved that bird?" He nodded. "Hands need work, even when they cannot fight." She smiled, small but real. It was kind. "Folks will see that sooner or later." His gaze lifted, holding hers steady. "Or they will never see. But it doesn't change the truth." The words hung between them. Clara swallowed hard, realizing how rarely anyone in Dry Creek spoke of truth without twisting it into gossip or threat. Later, when the lamps were low, Samuel sat by the hearth, whittling another piece of wood. Clara mended shirts nearby, needle flashing in the firelight. The domestic quiet wrapped around them, fragile but warm. For the first time since her husband's death, Clara felt something like peace within her walls. Yet peace was thin. That night, riders did not return, but gossip did. At Sunday service, Reverend Blackwood's voice rang harsh from the pulpit. "The widow has yoked herself to heathen blood. What will the Lord's judgment be on Dry Creek if such sin stands unchecked?" Clara felt eyes burning into her back as she sat alone in the pew. Samuel, wisely, had stayed behind. She lifted her chin, refusing to shrink under their stares. But the sermon cut deep, sharpened by the nods of agreement around her. When she returned home, Samuel was splitting wood by the shed. He paused, seeing the strain in her face. "They said something," he guessed. Clara forced a smile. "They always do." She set down her basket. "But words won't mend a roof. Come inside. Supper's waiting." He studied her for a moment longer, then nodded. They walked back together, side by side. The ranch loomed plain and worn, but in that moment, Clara thought it looked stronger somehow, its beams braced by more than nails, by a bond slowly forming. Inside, as firelight flickered over the tokens on the table, the colt and the arrowhead, she felt it again, that ember of trust, glowing brighter with every day they survived. The wind carried voices sharper than knives. Dry Creek was never quiet when gossip took root. By midweek, the store clerks, the smith, and even the school children repeated whispers that began in church pews. Widow Whitford had taken a savage into her home. She had bought him like stock, and worse, she treated him as an equal. Clara heard it with every step into town. Women turned their faces when she passed. Men chuckled in low groups outside the saloon. The sting of it pressed harder than the desert sun, yet she carried herself upright, basket on her arm, chin high. At the ranch, Samuel kept working. The barn roof no longer sagged, the corral stood truer, and the water trough held a clear reflection. Yet he felt the eyes too. Riders slowed on. The road, watching too long, hands resting on their gun belts. That evening, Morrison returned. He came without warning, his stallion cutting a dark shape against the low light. Clara was gathering eggs when she saw him ride up. Samuel stood from the woodpile, his hat shadowing his eyes. Morrison dismounted, his spurs striking sharply on the porch. "Evening, widow," he said, smoothly tipping his hat. "I thought we ought to talk properly. After all, neighbors should understand one another." Clara wiped her hands on her apron. "I believe we understand one another just fine." He chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. "You've made yourself quite the spectacle. Folks don't take kindly to such alliances. Preacher says it's an abomination. I say it's a poor investment." His eyes swept the barn, the fences, the newly patched roof. "This place is barely standing. Sell it to me now, and I'll let you walk away with some dignity." Samuel stepped forward, placing himself between Morrison and the porch. His voice was low, steady. She said no. Morrison's smile thinned. "Careful, friend. A man with no rights should mind his tongue." Clara's blood surged hot. She stepped down beside Samuel. "I won't sell. Not now. Not ever. You'll not have this land." For a long moment, Morrison stared at her, his jaw tight. Then he smirked, adjusting his gloves. "Stubbornness is a fine quality in cattle, widow. Less so in women, but no matter. Sooner or later, everyone bows." He mounted and rode off, dust swirling behind him. When the sound faded, Clara's knees nearly gave. Samuel's hand hovered at her elbow, steadying without touching. She drew a breath, forcing strength back into her voice. "He'll press harder. Now." Samuel nodded. "Then we'll press harder back." That night, the threat became clear. Just after midnight, the sound of hooves circled the house. Clara sat bolt upright in bed, heart pounding. Samuel was already at the door, rifle in hand. Lantern light flickered through the window as riders passed, shouting crude names, throwing stones that clattered against the walls. Clara lit the hearth fire, Colt at her side. Samuel stood in the doorway, broad and immovable, the rifle gleaming in the glow. "Keep back," he told her. The riders circled once more, their laughter trailing like wolves. Then, as suddenly as they'd come, they vanished into the night. Silence fell, broken only by Clara's ragged breathing. She lowered the Colt, her hands shaking. "This won't stop," she whispered. Samuel set the rifle down and turned, his eyes meeting hers. Fear is their weapon. If you yield, they win. If you stand, they break. Clara swallowed hard, her chest tight. She thought of her husband's death, of nights spent alone in fear of debt collectors, storms, and hunger. She had endured all that, and now she was not alone. The next day, neighbors came under the guise of kindness. Mrs. Talbot returned with another basket, her eyes flicking toward Samuel as he worked in the yard. "Clara, dear," she said sweetly, "it isn't too late. You can send him away. People will forgive. They might even forget." Clara placed the basket firmly back in her hands. "If forgiveness means surrender, I want none of it." That evening, Samuel brought in a small carving, a hawk, wings spread wide. He set it on the table beside the arrowhead. "Strength comes in flight," he said quietly. Clara placed her hand on the hawk, her fingers brushing his for the briefest instant. The touch sent a tremor through her, but she did not pull back. "Then let's hope it carries us through." Outside, thunder rolled on the horizon. A storm gathered, not just in the sky, but in Dry Creek itself. Morrison's patience had run dry, and the preacher's sermons grew louder. Both were circling, closing in. But inside that cabin, the fire burned warm, and for a moment, Clara let herself believe that strength and trust could outlast even the darkest storm. The fire started with a scream no one could ignore. It was near sundown when the alarm rang through Dry Creek. Clara and Samuel had just finished hauling water from the well when the sound split the air. High, panicked, a child's cry, tangled with shouts. Smoke curled above the ridge, black against the fading sky. Clara dropped her bucket, heart lurching. "That's the Talbots' barn." Samuel was already running, his long strides eating the distance. Clara hitched the wagon. With trembling hands, the horse tossing its head at the scent of smoke. She urged it forward, wheels rattling, Samuel keeping pace until they crested the rise. The barn blazed like a torch, flames licking skyward, the heat fierce even at a distance. Villagers swarmed, passing buckets in a frantic line. But above the chaos, one sound tore clearer than the rest, a child's scream from inside the inferno. "Daniel's still in there," Mrs. Talbot sobbed, clutching her apron. "He went back for the calf." The crowd froze. Men shifted, but none moved forward. The flames roared, sparks snapping like gunfire. The doorway belched smoke so thick it choked the air. Then Samuel stepped through the line, his face grim. Without a word, he pulled a wet blanket from a barrel, wrapped it over his shoulders, and plunged into the fire. "Samuel!" Clara shouted, but he was gone, swallowed by the smoke. Inside, the heat clawed at his lungs, the fire snarling like a beast. He pushed through, eyes stinging, searching. A small figure huddled near the far stall, coughing, crying. Samuel staggered forward, grabbed the boy, and wrapped him tight in the blanket. Flames leapt, beams cracked, the roof groaned. With the child pressed to his chest, Samuel barreled back toward the door. A burning beam crashed, grazing his shoulder, the pain searing, but he pushed harder, bursting out into the night as the barn collapsed behind him. The crowd erupted. Mrs. Talbot screamed her son's name, snatching him into her arms. The boy coughed, clinging to her neck, alive. Samuel dropped to his knees, smoke pouring from his lungs. Clara was there in an instant, water in her hands, pressing it to his mouth, her other hand gripping his shoulder with desperate strength. "You fool," she whispered fiercely. "You brave, blessed fool." Murmurs rippled through the onlookers. For the first time, eyes that had judged him harshly now looked different, awed, grateful. A man who risked his life for a neighbor's child could not be dismissed as savage. When Samuel stood again, weary but unbroken, Mr. Talbot clasped his hand. "I owe you my boy's life," he said thickly. "If ever you need a thing—" His words choked, but the meaning hung heavy. That night, the town spoke in new tones. Some still sneered, clinging to old prejudice, but others nodded with grudging respect. A man who ran into fire was a man worth reckoning with. Back at the ranch, Clara tended Samuel's burned shoulder, her hands gentle as she smeared salve across the raw skin. He winced but made no sound. "You didn't have to go in," she whispered. "Yes," he said simply. "I did." Her hands stilled. She looked up, meeting his eyes in the lamplight. Something passed between them. More than gratitude, more than respect. A bond forged in smoke and fire, unspoken but undeniable. Samuel shifted, pulling something from his pocket, the cedar hawk he had carved days before. He set it on the table between them. "For the boy," he murmured. Clara swallowed. "Hard. And what of you? Who carves for the man who saved him?" For the first time, a faint smile tugged at his lips. "No need. The fire already carved its mark." Silence fell, warm and close. Clara's hand lingered on his arm a moment longer than it should have. Then she drew back, setting the salve aside. Her cheeks flushed. Outside, the night air was cooler, softer. But the town's fire had done more than burn a barn. It had lit a spark in Dry Creek, one that could not easily be put out. The next morning, when Clara rode into town for supplies, heads turned as always. But now some tipped their hats, others nodded with something close to respect. Children whispered, excitedly, of the man who had run through fire. Even Reverend Blackwood faltered when his sermon brushed against the subject, his words sharp, but his congregation less eager to echo them. Clara carried herself taller, shoulders squared. Samuel had earned more than survival. He had earned a place, whether the town was ready to grant it or not. At supper that night, she raised her cup toward him. To stand when the world would rather we fall. Samuel lifted his in return, their gazes locking across the flicker of firelight. No more words were needed. The hammer's echo rang louder than any sermon. Word of Samuel's rescue spread faster than a prairie fire. By the week's end, men gathered for a barn raising on the Talbot land, and for the first time, Clara and Samuel were invited to join. Clara hesitated at first, half expecting it to be a trap for gossip more than gratitude. But Samuel only said, "Work builds bridges. We'll go." The morning dawned crisp, the air smelling of sawdust and earth. Wagons circled the site, women spreading quilts with baskets of food, children chasing dogs between piles of timber. Men lifted beams, voices booming with orders and laughter. But when Samuel and Clara arrived, silence rippled through the crowd. He carried no tools but his own hands, broad, calloused, steady. Clara walked beside him, her chin high despite the weight of stairs. Then one man, Mr. Talbot, broke through the stillness. "Glad you came," he said, thrusting a hammer toward Samuel. "Could use your strength." That single gesture shifted the air. Samuel took the hammer, nodded once, and set to work. Through the day, he lifted beams with 2 men's weight, balanced on rafters with sure feet, and swung the hammer in rhythm with the others. Sweat streaked his face. His shirt clung to his shoulders, but his movements never faltered. Slowly, the murmurs changed. Men who had muttered savage now muttered strong, steady, useful. Clara carried water and bread, watching as Samuel worked. Her heart swelled each time she saw another neighbor clap him on the back, or children gather at the edge of the frame to gape at the man who moved with such tireless skill. Even the women, at first whispering behind their bonnets, began to soften, offering him pie, passing him cups of cool cider. By sundown, the barn stood tall, its rafters proud against the sky. The men cheered, caps raised, laughter rolling across the field. Mr. Talbot clapped Samuel's shoulder. "Strong as an ox, steady as an oak. We'll toast you tonight, neighbor." The word hung heavy, neighbor. Clara felt the shift like a ducker creaking open, the first crack of acceptance breaking through the walls of suspicion. That evening, tables were spread with food, lanterns hung from branches, and fiddles played. Men raised mugs of beer, and for the first time, Samuel was, not on the edge, but among them. He sat at the long table, Clara at his side, the arrowhead still in his pocket, the weight of belonging strange but solid. Voices rose in a toast. To Samuel. A man worth his strength and worth his word. Clara's heart caught. She looked. At him across the table, saw the faintest flicker of something new in his eyes. Hope, fragile but real. But at the edge of the crowd, one face stayed hard. Dale Morrison leaned against a fence post, arms crossed, a sour curl on his lips. He had watched the day unfold, watched Samuel win what Morrison had tried to deny. The town's cheer cut at him like barbed wire. His glass remained untouched. Later, as Clara packed leftovers into a basket, Morrison approached, his voice a low growl meant for her ears alone. "Don't think this changes anything. You and your purchase may fool them for a day, but it won't last. Preacher's with me. The law's with me, and when the time comes, they'll turn on him just as fast." Clara straightened, basket in her hands, eyes fierce. "The law sold him like cattle. If that's justice, I'll stand against it all my days." Morrison's grin was thin, humorless. "Then you'll stand alone. And alone is easy prey." He turned and vanished into the crowd, leaving his warning to sink like poison. On the ride home, the wagon creaked, the stars wheeling bright overhead. Clara sat quietly, her hands folded tight in her lap. Samuel glanced at her once, then spoke. "He hates what he cannot break." Clara looked at him, surprised at the calm in his tone. "You don't fear him?" "I have known men like him all my life," Samuel said. "They believe strength is taking. They do not understand that strength is keeping." Her chest tightened, the words striking deep. "Then we'll keep," she whispered. At the cabin, the fire burned warmly. Samuel set down the tools he had carried back. Clara lingered at the table, watching him, feeling the bond between them thicken like braided rope. That night, as she lay awake listening to the wind, she thought of the barn standing tall, of the neighbors who had toasted him, and of Morrison's. Shadow still circling. The story was shifting. Samuel had taken his first step into belonging. But belonging always drew the sharpest knives. The preacher's voice carried further than any gunshot. Sunday morning, the bell in Dry Creek tolled slow and heavy, calling the faithful to Reverend Blackwood's service. Clara did not attend. This time, after the last sermon, she had no stomach for another round of venom disguised as scripture. Instead, she stayed at the ranch, mending harness leather by the window. But Samuel went into town. He said little as he saddled the horse, only, "Best to face words than run from them." Clara wanted to argue, but something in his steady gaze silenced her. Inside the white clapboard church, the pews overflowed. Blackwood's frame loomed in the pulpit, tall and severe, his voice booming over bowed heads. "Sin has crept into our midst. A woman, widowed and vulnerable, has yoked herself to heathen blood. Shall we allow it? Shall we let our town rot?" "From within," murmurs swelled like embers catching wind. Samuel stood at the back, hat in hand, silent as stone. His eyes never left the preacher, though the weight of every gaze in the room pressed against him. Blackwood slammed his Bible shut. "The Lord's word is clear. Darkness cannot dwell with light. If we do not act, his judgment will fall, not on her alone, but on all of us." By the time the service ended, the crowd's mood had shifted. Whispers grew sharper, faces harder. Morrison moved among them like a wolf among sheep, his smile satisfied. He clasped Blackwood's hand in the doorway, their pact sealed with a grip. Samuel returned to the ranch at dusk. Clara was waiting on the porch, her heart tight with worry. "What did he say?" she asked. "Enough to rouse a crowd," Samuel answered simply. His face was unreadable, but his shoulders carried a weight she had not seen before. That night, the tension broke. Lanterns bobbed in the distance, riders again, but more than before. Clara counted at least a dozen shadows moving against the ridge. Samuel stood in the doorway, rifle in hand, while Clara clutched the Colt at the window. The riders stopped short of the yard. One voice rang out, Blackwood's, deep and commanding. "Widow Whitford, send him out, and your soul may yet be saved." Clara stepped onto the porch before Samuel could stop her. Her voice cut through the night, sharp and fierce. "My soul is mine, Reverend, and no man here will decide its worth," the riders muttered, shifting uneasily. Samuel stepped beside her, silent but solid. The firelight from their lanterns threw his shadow long against the cabin wall. Morrison's voice followed, slick and mocking. "You think you've won them, widow? A barn, a toast, a few claps on the back. That fades. What lasts is power, and I have it." The Colt was steady in Clara's hands, though her heart thundered. "You have fear. That's all." For a tense moment, the standoff held. The mob shifted, half eager, half uncertain. Then Samuel raised his voice, calm but carrying. "If fire could not burn me, your threats will not break me. Leave now, or face what you've begun." A murmur ran through the riders. Some pulled their horses back, others whispered angrily. Blackwood's face twisted in fury, but even he saw the crowd's wavering courage. At last, he spat into the dirt. "This is not finished." The lanterns wheeled away, the thunder of hooves fading into the night. Inside, Clara sagged against the doorframe, her breath ragged. Samuel lowered the rifle, his expression unchanged. "They'll be back," she whispered. "Yes," he said, simply. "But so will we." The following days were thick with tension. Some neighbors avoided them, others offered quiet nods of support. At the general store, Clara overheard men debating in hushed tones, some saying Samuel had proven himself, others warning that Morrison and Blackwood wouldn't stop until the ranch was ashes. Clara walked through it all with her head high, but at night, fear pressed heavier than blankets. She found herself listening for every hoofbeat, every creak of the fence. One evening, she stepped onto the porch to find Samuel whittling by the lamplight. He looked up, his face softened by the glow. "Why do you stay?" she asked suddenly. The words slipped out before she could catch them. "After all they've done, why not leave, find peace elsewhere?" His hands stilled. He studied the carving, then set it down. "Because peace is not found. It is made. Here, with work, with trust, with those who stand when others fall." Clara's breath caught. For a moment, she saw not the man the town called savage, but the man who had carried a boy from fire, who stood unshaken against mobs and threats, a man worth standing beside. She turned back toward the door, her voice quiet but firm. "Then we'll make it here." Behind them, thunder rolled again on the horizon. This time it was not weather, it was the gathering storm of men who feared what they could not control. Paper can cut deeper than steel when wielded by the wrong hands. 3 mornings after the standoff, Clara found a folded notice nailed to her gatepost. The paper flapped in the wind, the sheriff's seal smeared across it. Her stomach tightened. Before she even read the words, "Claim of unlawful harboring." The document was simple, cruel in its clarity. Samuel was accused of trespass, of unlawful presence, of threatening the peace of Dry Creek. Any citizen aiding him could be charged with harboring. The complaint bore 2 signatures, Reverend Blackwood and Dale Morrison. Clara's fingers crushed the paper, her breath sharp in her chest. When Samuel came from the barn, she thrust it toward him. "They're using the law now," she said bitterly. He scanned the words, expression unchanged. "Law is just another chain when men twist it." Clara's voice rose, trembling. "If they drag you off again, Samuel, if they put you back in chains—" He looked at her then, eyes steady. "I will not kneel for them. Not again." That afternoon, Sheriff McKenna rode up with 2 deputies. Clara met them on the porch, Colt hidden at her side. McKenna shifted uneasily in his saddle. "Widow, you know how this works. The papers are signed. I've got to bring him in. No, Clara said flatly. Samuel stepped forward, placing himself at her side. If they want me, they'll take me from her land with her blood on their hands. Do they want that written? In the town's history? McKenna hesitated. His deputies glanced at one another, uncertain. The sheriff spat into the dust, clearly torn between duty and conscience. At last, he tugged his reins. Fine, but this won't end here. Morrison's pushing hard, and the reverend's stirring folk hotter every Sunday. He turned his horse, muttering. I can't protect you if the whole town comes. When they rode off, Clara sagged against the porch rail, heart pounding. Samuel caught her elbow, steadying her. They'll try again, she whispered. Yes, he said. But now the law itself is a weapon. We must turn it back on them. That evening, neighbors trickled in quietly, Mr. Talbot among them. He set his hat on the table, eyes full of unease. I heard what Morrison's pulling, he said. Man, saves my boy and this is the thanks he gets? I won't stand by. If they call a hearing, I'll speak. Clara's throat tightened with gratitude. Thank you, Henry. Another neighbor, Mrs. Green, brought bread. Her voice shook as she said, My husband won't speak, but I saw what Samuel did. A man who runs into fire for a child deserves better than this. Samuel listened in silence, his gaze steady, on each of them. When they left, Clara turned to him. They're afraid, but they're not blind. You've changed more than you think. He shook his head. One barn doesn't wash away a lifetime of lies. Clara reached across the table, touching the arrowhead that lay there. Then we'll keep telling the truth until it does. Following week, Blackwood thundered from the pulpit, waving the complaint paper like a holy writ. This man is a threat to our homes, to our wives, to our children. And she, his voice sharpened, she is a Jezebel who leads him into our midst. Will you stand idle while evil plants roots in Dry Creek? Morrison sat smugly in the front pew, nodding, feeding the crowd's anger with every tilt of his head. Some men shouted in agreement, their fists slamming pews. Others shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the door as though weighing whether to stay. Outside the church, whispers turned into plans. Talk of forming a committee, of riding to enforce the claim if the sheriff wouldn't. The storm was gathering, faster and darker than Clara feared. Back at the ranch, she and Samuel prepared as best they could. Fences were checked, tools sharpened, and the rifle cleaned. Clara's hands shook as she polished the Colt, but her resolve held. If they come, I'll stand, she told him. Samuel watched her, his face unreadable. Then, with deliberate care, he placed the arrowhead into her palm. Keep this. If they take me, you'll remember I stood free. Her throat tightened. They won't take you, she said fiercely. Not while I breathe. That night, thunder rolled again. Not from weather, but from hooves on distant roads, voices carried on the wind. Dry Creek was shifting into open war. Morrison had law on his side. The preacher had fire in his tongue, and the town was caught between fear and gratitude. And in the middle stood Clara and Samuel, two against many, bound by choice and trust, with only the truth and their courage. To shield them, the riders came like a storm that would not pass. The night was too still, the kind of stillness that pressed against the skin and made the hairs rise. Clara sat by the hearth, sewing by lamplight, though her needle trembled more than it should. Samuel cleaned the rifle at the table, every motion, deliberate, calm, as though preparing for harvest instead of war. Then came the sound. Hooves, many of them, rolling like thunder over hard earth. Clara froze, the thread slipping from her fingers. Samuel's head lifted, eyes narrowing. He rose, checked the rifle one last time, and moved to the door. Lanterns flared outside, weaving through the dark. A dozen, maybe more. The yard filled with riders, their faces shadowed by kerchiefs, but the voices were unmistakable. Dale Morrison, sat at the front, smug and solid, while Reverend Blackwood's figure loomed beside him, Bible in one hand, torch in the other. "Clara Whitford," Blackwood's voice thundered across the yard, "you harbor sin, and sin shall be purged. Surrender. This man or the fire will fall on your house." Clara stepped into the doorway, Colt in her hand, the lamplight at her back. Her heart pounded so hard she feared it might betray her voice. Still, she lifted it steadily. "This is my land, my home, and he is under my roof. You'll not touch him." Morrison laughed, cruel and loud. "Look at you, widow, shaking in your skirts, thinking you can stand against men. You'll lose everything for him, everything." Samuel stepped beside her, rifle in hand, silent as a shadow. The firelight caught his face, unflinching. "You talk of God and law," he said evenly, "but you bring chains and fire. There is no truth in you." The mob stirred, uneasy. Some muttered agreement. Others spat into the dirt. Morrison's smile faltered, so he raised his voice sharply. "Enough! He's mine by law, and this land's mine by right. Take him." Several riders spurred forward, but Samuel raised the rifle, the barrel gleaming. Clara lifted the Colt, her finger steady on the trigger. "The first man crosses that fence," she called. "Doesn't ride back." The riders hesitated. The fence line loomed like a wall. Blackwood's torch sputtered, its light throwing their shadows tall and jagged across the yard. Fear rippled through them, but Morrison pressed harder. "You'll stand for him?" he snarled. "For a savage who's brought nothing but trouble?" Clara's voice cut like a blade. "I'll stand for a man who's worked honestly, who saved a child when others turned away. I'll stand for truth before I bow to your greed." The silence that followed was heavy as stone. Then Samuel lifted his voice, strong enough for all to hear. "I saved your children. I built your barns. I stood while you spat at me. If this is how you repay truth, then do it before your God, and see if he calls it just." The mob wavered. Some lowered their torches, their courage faltering under the weight of his words. Others shifted uneasily in their saddles, unwilling to be the first to strike. Blackwood snarled, raising his torch high. "Weakness!" he bellowed. "This town will burn for its weakness!" He hurled the torch toward the barn, but Samuel moved. Faster, he fired, the crack splitting the night, the torch shattered in midair, sparks raining harmlessly into the dirt. The crowd gasped, stunned. Morrison's horse reared, nearly throwing him. Clara's Colt was steady, aimed square at Blackwood's chest. "Try again," she said coldly, "and the fire won't be all you face." The riders pulled back, their courage broken by the sudden crack of gunfire and the widow's unshaken aim. One by one, they wheeled their horses, muttering, their anger dissolving into fear. Only Morrison and Blackwood lingered, their faces twisted with rage. "This isn't over," Morrison spat, his voice raw. "The town will turn. You'll see." Blackwood pointed a trembling finger, his words like venom. "God's wrath will find you, both of you. You cannot defy heaven." Then, like wolves who had lost their hunt, they turned and rode into the eye, dark, lanterns swinging wildly in retreat. Clara lowered the Colt at last, her arms trembling now that the danger had passed. Samuel set the rifle on the table, his eyes scanning the horizon until the last hoofbeat faded. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Clara whispered, "You saved us." He shook his head. "No, we stood together. That saved us." The fire in the hearth crackled, the only sound in the cabin. Clara's chest ached with both relief and fear, but beneath it burned something fiercer, a pride she had not felt in years. Together they had faced down the storm. But storms returned, and both of them knew the darkest hour had not yet come. Morning broke, but the air still smelled of smoke that never was. The night after the mob, Clara slept little. Each creak of the cabin boards, each restless sigh of the wind, sounded like hoofbeats returning. She lay awake listening to Samuel's quiet breathing from his place by the hearth, the rifle propped within arm's reach. Fear had kept her body tense, but pride, strange and unyielding, kept her spirit upright. When dawn came, Samuel rose without a word, as if the night had been nothing but another test in a long string of trials. He hauled water, chopped wood, and tended the stock. His calm was steadying, yet Clara could see it. The faint stiffness in his jaw, the way his eyes searched the ridge for movement. He carried the weight of danger with every step, but he carried it as if it were no heavier than his hammer. By midday, neighbors began to arrive. First came Mr. Talbot, hat in hand, face grave. "Heard the commotion," he said. "Folks talking. Some say you provoked it. Some say you held the line better than any sheriff." He looked at Samuel with clear eyes. "For my part, I stand with you. After what you did for my boy, I won't forget." Clara's throat tightened. "Thank you. Henry, that means more than I can say." Not long after, Mrs. Green appeared with a basket of bread and dried apples. She set it firmly on the porch, her eyes darting around as if fearful of being seen. "Some folks in town are calling it blasphemy, standing against the reverend like that. But I tell you plain, God's hand was on you last night. You both, I stood righteous." Her words were a balm, though Clara knew they came at a cost. Mrs. Green's husband might not agree, and others would whisper louder for every kindness shown. Still, bread tasted sweeter when baked with courage. By evening, the ranch yard was quieter again, but Clara felt the shift. Faint, fragile, but real. Not everyone stood with Morrison and Blackwood. Not everyone saw Samuel as savage. The town was splitting, cracks widening between fear and gratitude. Morrison saw it too. That night, he gathered his men at the saloon, buying rounds and speaking darkly of lawlessness, of a town losing its backbone. Blackwood fanned the flames from the calm pulpit, declaring fire and brimstone on Clara's household. "One act of mercy cannot wash away heathen blood," he thundered. "If we falter now, the Lord himself will strike us down." But in the corners of the saloon, men muttered of the boy Samuel saved, of the barn raised strong with his hands. And in kitchen whispers, women spoke of the widow who stood with colt in hand, unshaken against a mob. The next morning, Clara and Samuel hitched the wagon and rode into town for supplies. The air was taut with stares. At the general store, silence fell as they entered. Clara felt the heat of eyes on her back, but she kept her chin high, basket steady. Samuel walked at her side, calm as stone, though every muscle carried readiness. At the counter, old Mr. Wilkins cleared his throat. "You'll pay cash?" he asked, his eyes flicking between them. "Yes," Clara said firmly, laying down coins. A pause. Then Wilkins nodded, bagged her goods, and slid them across the counter. It was a small act, but in that silence, it felt like thunder. Outside, a child broke from her mother's grasp and ran up to Samuel. In her hand was the cedar hawk he had carved, wings spread wide. "It's still on my shelf," she said shyly. "I keep it safe." Samuel crouched, his face softening. "Then you keep flying," he told her gently. The mother pulled the girl back, her face red with fear, but the child's words lingered. People had seen. People remembered. That evening, Clara set the colt back on the mantel, beside the arrowhead and the hawk. "We've gained some ground," she whispered, "but Morrison won't let go." Samuel nodded. "He will push harder. He fears what he cannot own." Clara met his gaze, her voice low but firm. "Then he will learn this ranch isn't his to claim, and I'm not his to silence." The firelight flickered across their faces, across the tokens of grief and trust laid on the table. The world outside is still threatened, still pressed. But in that cabin, something stronger was forming, a partnership neither paper nor prejudice could erase. And for the first time,
Clara let herself believe they might not only endure, but prevail. Some truths come like storms. You don't ask for them, but they break the silence anyway.
The days after the mob passed quieter than Clara expected. No riders, no torches, no paper nailed to the gate. Yet the stillness carried weight, as if Morrison and Blackwood were merely drawing breath before the next strike. One evening, after chores were finished and the supper dishes stacked away, Clara found Samuel on the porch, sharpening a hatchet by lamplight. The rhythm of stone against steel was steady, comforting in its own way. She stepped out, arms folded against the night. "Chill, you never speak of before," she said softly. Samuel didn't look up. "Before what?" "Before Dry Creek. Before the cell. Before—" She trailed off, unsure if she had the right to ask. For a long moment, the only sound was the rasp of stone. Then Samuel set the hatchet aside and leaned back, eyes fixed on the horizon where the stars burned low. "I was taken from my people when I was a boy. Soldiers burned our camp, drove us out. They called it relocation. My father was cut down trying to shield us. My mother made me run. I never saw her again." His voice was flat, stripped of emotion, but the words struck Clara like hammer blows. He touched the arrowhead at his chest. "This is all I carried. It was meant for my first hunt. Instead, it became my last tie." Clara's throat tightened. She sank onto the porch step, her hands twisting in her lap. "I'm sorry." Samuel shook his head. "Sorry does not raise the dead." His gaze shifted to her, steady. "But truth keeps them from being forgotten." The silence stretched between them, heavy, but not empty. Clara drew a breath. "Then I'll tell you mine." Her hands trembled, but she forced the words out. "My husband, Elias, wasn't always kind. Folks thought he was steady, hard-working. But when the fever came, he cursed me for not bearing him sons. Said the Lord had judged me barren. He died with that bitterness on his lips, and I buried him with the same colt that's on my mantle." Her voice cracked, but she pressed on. "Since then, this ranch has been my burden, my punishment, maybe even my penance. And I've carried it alone because I thought that was all I deserved." Samuel's eyes softened, though his face remained still. "You deserved more." The words broke something in her. She turned away, blinking back tears, ashamed of them. But then she felt it, his hand, rough and calloused, resting lightly on hers. Not claiming, not pressing, just steady. Clara let out a shuddering breath. "Maybe we're both carrying ghosts." Samuel nodded once. "Then we carry them together, the shai." Night air settled around them, full of the scent of mesquite and wood smoke. For the first time since Elias's death, Clara felt her burden ease. Not because it was gone, but because someone else was willing to shoulder part of its weight. Over the following days, something shifted in their rhythm. Samuel whittled more, often, leaving small carvings on the table, birds, horses, a wolf with sharp eyes. Clara mended his shirts, her stitches precise, her hands less hurried now. They shared bread without words, laughter in small moments, silence without discomfort. Neighbors noticed too. Mrs. Green saw them riding side by side into town and whispered to another woman, "There's more than labor binding them." The Marsa gossip spread, sharp as thorns, but beneath it grew something else, quieter and stronger, respect, curiosity, even admiration. At the store, a boy tugged Samuel's sleeve and asked if he'd teach him to carve. Samuel obliged, handing him a smooth scrap of cedar. The boy's father frowned but said nothing, watching as his son's eyes lit up with wonder. Back at the ranch, Clara placed fresh flowers in a jar on the mantel. The colt, the arrowhead, and now the cedar hawk sat together, tokens of grief and survival, but also of something new, of trust forming into the beginnings of love. That night, as rain pattered lightly on the roof, Clara sat by the fire with Samuel. She found herself smiling at the sound, remembering how leaks once kept her awake. Now the patched roof held firm. "You've mended more than fences here," she said softly. Samuel's gaze held hers across the glow. "So have you." The fire cracked, filling the silence that followed. Clara's heart beat unsteadily, but she didn't turn away. She let the warmth linger, fragile and unspoken, but real. The storm outside passed quickly, but inside, something had taken root. Something no preacher's sermon or rancher's threat could easily uproot. The trap was set with ink before it was sprung with fire. The quiet days after the rain did not last. By the week's end, another paper arrived, this time delivered by a deputy who would not meet Clara's eyes. It was a summons. Samuel was to stand before the county judge on charges of unlawful residence and breach of peace. The court date was set 2 weeks out, but everyone knew what it meant. Morrison had moved beyond mobs and whispers. Now he wielded the courthouse like a weapon. Clara read the paper twice, her hands cold despite the summer sun. "They'll twist the judge," she murmured. "Morrison's money buys half the county." Samuel took the paper, folded it once, and tucked it into his pocket. Law is their tongue. Truth will be ours. But truth was fragile when men like Blackwood painted lies as scripture. That Sunday, the Reverend thundered louder than ever, his voice shaking the rafters. "Evil hides in our valley. A woman flaunts God's order, sheltering heathen blood. In her own home, will we be cowards, or will we cleanse this place with righteous hands?" The congregation stirred, their fear fanned into fervor. Morrison stood at the back, his arms folded, eyes glinting. The alliance between preacher and rancher had become ironclad, and Dry Creek trembled beneath it. At the ranch, Clara and Samuel prepared in silence. She baked bread, her motions sharp and restless. He cut firewood until blisters split his hands. Neither spoke of fear, but both carried it in the set of their jaws. That night, neighbors came again. Fewer this time, and more cautious. Henry. Talbot brought a sack of seed, setting it down with quiet finality. "I can't fight Morrison outright," he said, "but I won't see you starve. If the judge listens to anyone, I'll stand." Mrs. Green came too, but her voice shook as she spoke. "Some folks say God's hand is against you. I don't believe it, but I can't stop them whispering." She placed a jar of preserves on the table, tears shining in her eyes. "Hold. Fast, Clara." After they left, Clara sank into her chair, staring at the tokens on the mantel, the colt, the arrowhead, the hawk. Her voice broke as she whispered, "Why must goodness always pay the heavier price?" Samuel's gaze was steady. "Because only goodness is worth paying for." The words struck deep. Clara turned away, swallowing hard, ashamed of the tears that blurred her eyes. The following week, tension in Dry Creek boiled. The saloon filled with talk of justice and order. Blackwood's sermons drew bigger crowds than ever. And Morrison, behind it all, bought drinks freely, smiling as men swore they'd stand by his claim. One night, as Clara doused the lamps, Samuel caught the faint glow of lanterns moving along the ridge. Not a mob. Not yet. Just scouts, watching. His jaw tightened. They measure us, waiting for the right night. Clara's fear cracked into anger. Let them come. Let them see we won't bend. Samuel studied her, admiration flickering in his eyes. Your fire burns hotter than theirs. That's what frightens them most. But the storm broke sooner than expected. 3 nights later, Clara woke to the acrid sting of smoke. She bolted upright. Flames licked at the edge of the barn, torches planted against its walls. Samuel was already outside, shovel in one hand, bucket in the other. "Water!" he called, and Clara ran with him, her skirts heavy with dew. Together they doused the flames before they caught, stamping out sparks with desperate speed. By dawn, the barn still stood, blackened but whole. On the ground, near the Kai gate, lay a message scrawled in ash. Not yours. Never yours. Clara stared at it, her fists clenched. Samuel touched her shoulder gently. They will not stop. No, she whispered fiercely, and neither will I. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, Clara loaded the Colt and placed it on the mantel once more. Samuel sharpened the hatchet, his hands steady despite the fresh blisters. Together, they stood in the cabin's doorway, watching. The fields stretched quietly before them. The land was scarred, but it was still theirs, and both knew the next strike would not come with fire in the dark. It would come in broad daylight, with law and bullets behind it. The storm was almost here. The parade. Gavel struck like thunder, though the sky outside was clear. The county courthouse stood squat and stern in the heart of Dry Creek, its walls sun-bleached, its roofline crooked. On the morning of Samuel's hearing, the streets filled as though for a festival. Wagons crowded the square, townsfolk pressed. Shoulder to shoulder, gossip flying faster than dust in the wind. Clara gripped the reins of her wagon, jaw tight. Beside her, Samuel sat calm, hat low, the arrowhead warm against his chest. She wanted to speak, to ease the knot of fear twisting inside her. But no words seemed strong enough. So they rode in silence, letting the wheels rattle their defiance. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with murmurs. The judge sat high behind his desk, robes rumpled, spectacles perched on his nose. Sheriff McKenna leaned against the back wall, arms folded, his face unreadable. Morrison sat near the front, polished boots, crossed, his smirk spreading like oil. Reverend Blackwood loomed at his side, Bible clutched like a weapon. Case of unlawful harboring, the judge intoned, voice dry. Widow Clara Whitford, accused of sheltering a man outside the law. Samuel, he stumbled, uncertain whether to use a last name, then waved it off. The accused, charged with breach of peace and trespass. We'll hear arguments. Morrison was first. He rose with practiced confidence, his words slick. Your Honor, we are a town built on order, on law. This man was auctioned fair and square, property, not a citizen. Yet the widow has defied both law and decency, parading him as if equal, threatening peace. We ask only for justice, his removal, her fine, and this stain cleansed. Blackwood followed, his voice booming. Scripture is clear, unequal yoking. Brings wrath. We must protect our children, our women, our very souls. Applause broke from some in the gallery, shouts of Amen, rising like sparks. Clara's stomach knotted, but she rose slowly, her voice calm, clear. Your Honor, I bought his freedom. With the last of my money, I bought not a man as property, but a man's right to live. He has worked harder than any neighbor, saved a child from fire and raised a barn with his hands. If that is breach of peace, then peace is not worth keeping. A murmur rippled. Samuel stood next, his frame filling the room without effort. He spoke low, steady, every word, striking like iron. You call me savage. You call me a threat, but I have harmed no man here. I bled for your children. I stood when your fires rose. If the law says that it is a crime, then your law is broken. The room stilled. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across faces. Even the judge shifted, clearing his throat. Do we have witnesses? Henry Talbot rose from the benches. His voice shook, but his words carried. This man saved my boy. Went into the fire when none of us dared. I owe him my son's life. Call him what you will, but I call him neighbor. Gasps broke. Mrs. Green stood too, her hands trembling. And I saw him at the barn raising, steady, as any man. If he's a danger, then may God grant us more of his kind. The gallery erupted, half in protest, half in support. Shouts tangled. Savage against neighbor, outlaw against hero. The judge's gavel thundered until silence fell again. Morrison's face twisted, rage boiling beneath his polished calm. "These are soft words," he sneered. "The law is not swayed by sentiment." But Clara stepped forward, fire in her eyes. "Law without truth is nothing but chains, and we will not bow to chains." The judge leaned back, eyes weary. He looked at Samuel, then at Clara, then at the crowd that seethed and split before him. At last, he sighed. "This court finds insufficient cause to detain the accused at present. The charges are dismissed, though I warn you, tension this hot will not cool easily." The gavel struck again, echoing like thunder. Outside, the crowd spilled into the square, divided. Some shouted curses, others clapped Samuel on the back. Clara stood tall, her hand brushing his arm, her heart pounding with relief and dread. Morrison stalked past, his smile gone, his voice a venomous hiss. "You think you've won? Courts bend, mobs break, and I've got both in my pocket." Samuel met his glare with silence, his stillness sharper than any blade. Clara held her head high, though her knees shook. The battle had turned, but the war was far from over. The mask of law slipped, and only raw hunger remained. The courthouse ruling should have been the end. Instead, it was a spark. By the next morning, Morrison's fury spilled into the saloon, into whispered deals struck over whiskey, into coins pressed into eager palms. Men who had cheered Samuel at the barn raising now found themselves cornered, threatened, and promised favors if they turned against him. Reverend Blackwood thundered even louder from his pulpit. "The judge is blind, but the Lord is not. If the law fails, then righteous hands must strike." His words lit fire in the fearful, and by dusk, a mob had begun to form. Rougher men this time, armed with more than torches. Clara sensed it before it reached her gate. The air felt wrong, heavy like the moments before a storm breaks. She stacked wood by the door, checked the shutters twice, then loaded the Colt with hands that trembled only once before they steadied. Samuel sharpened the hatchet at the table, his motions calm, deliberate. "They come tonight," he said, as if stating the weather. Clara swallowed hard. "Do you think we can stand against them?" He looked at her, eyes dark but steady. "We don't need to stand against all, only long enough to break their will." The hours dragged. The sun fell, shadows stretched, and silence lay thick around the cabin. Then, faint at first, the sound of hooves, many hooves, rolling across the earth. Clara's heart leapt into her throat. Lanterns bobbed in the distance, dozens of them, like a string of fiery eyes moving closer. Samuel rose, rifle in hand. Clara gripped the Colt. Together they stepped onto the porch. The night air was sharp, carrying the smell of dust and fear. The mob spilled into the yard, at least 20 men this time. Morrison sat tall at the front, his stallion snorting, his face twisted with triumph. Blackwood loomed beside him, torch raised high, his voice already booming. "Now!" the preacher shouted. "Cleanse this place! Burn it down! Drive them out!" The mob roared, surging forward. Torches lifted, rifles cocked, boots thundering. Clara's voice rang sharp above the chaos. "The first man who crosses that fence meets my Colt." Her words cracked like a whip, but the riders barely slowed. Samuel fired a warning shot into the air. The crack split the night, echoing off the hills. For a heartbeat, the mob hesitated, but Morrison spurred his stallion forward. "Take him!" he snarled. "Take them both!" Men leapt from their horses, torches raised. The firelight painted their faces savage, shadows writhing across the yard. Clara's pulse hammered, but her hand was steady as she aimed the Colt square at the nearest figure. "Stop!" she shouted. He didn't. She fired. The shot ripped through the night, the man's torch tumbling into the dirt as he stumbled back. cursing, arm grazed. The mob faltered again, but Morrison bellowed, driving them harder. "Cowards! You'll let a widow and a redskin shame you!" They surged once more, but this time Samuel fired low, the bullet striking the ground so close to a man's boot that dust sprayed his face. The man cursed, stumbled, and retreated. Another rider hesitated, torch shaking in his hand. The mob's roar faltered, fear edging into their anger. Clara seized the moment, her voice ringing fierce. "You call yourselves men of God, men of law, but you come like thieves in the night. Samuel stood for your children, for your barns, while you hid behind sermons and coins. Look at yourselves. Look at the sin in your hands." The words cut sharper than bullets. The mob wavered, their torches sputtering in the night air. Some lowered theirs. One man turned his horse, muttering. Another followed. Morrison's fury boiled over. He drew his pistol, aiming square at Samuel. "If no one else will, I'll finish this." But before he could fire, Henry Talbot's voice rang out from the dark. "You'll do no such thing, Morrison." He rode into the yard, rifle raised, his face hard. Behind him came two more neighbors, Mrs. Green's eldest son and old man Wilkins from the store. "We've had enough of your poison," Talbot growled. "Samuel's worth 10 of you." The mob broke then, fear scattering them like leaves. Men dropped torches, mounted horses, and fled into the night. Blackwood shouted, his voice cracking with rage, but even he was swept away in the retreat. Only Morrison remained, his pistol still raised, his face twisted in hate. "This isn't over," he hissed, but his words rang hollow against the sudden quiet. At last, he wheeled his horse and vanished into the dark. Silence fell heavy, broken only by Clara's ragged breath. She lowered the Colt, her arms trembling. Samuel lowered the rifle, his gaze steady on the horizon. "You see," he murmured. "They break when the truth is held firm." Clara swallowed hard, tears burning her eyes. "We stood," she whispered. "We stood." The tokens on the mantel, Colt, arrowhead, hawk, gleamed in the lamplight when they stepped inside. For the first time, Clara felt they weren't just symbols of survival. They were proof of something greater, partnership, resilience, the first flicker of love forged in fire. But deep inside, she knew Morrison's hatred hadn't burned out. It had only gone underground, waiting for its chance to rise again. When hate runs out of shadows, it claws for daylight. For 2 days after the mob scattered, Dry Creek simmered. Gossip churned hotter than ever. Some whispered that Clara and Samuel had bewitched the town with trickery. Others, quietly, cautiously, spoke of bravery, of truth, of a stand that had shown more strength than any sermon. But Morrison did not vanish. He was seen in the saloon, drunk on fury, promising blood. He was seen whispering to drifters with guns strapped low, slipping them coins, and on the third morning, the storm he had been nursing broke wide open. The square of Dry Creek was crowded for market day when Morrison strode in, revolver glinting at his side, rage burning clear in his eyes. Blackwood trailed behind, his Bible clenched like a cudgel, shouting words of damnation. Samuel and Clara had come only for flour and salt, but suddenly the air sharpened, every gaze turning toward them. "There he is." Morrison's voice cracked like a whip. "The thief of law, the stain on this town. He hides behind a widow's skirts, but he won't hide today." He stepped into the square, pistol raised. The crowd gasped, scattering back. Clara froze, her heart pounding. The Colt was in her basket, hidden beneath cloth. Samuel stepped forward before she could reach it. He placed himself between her and Morrison, tall, steady, unarmed, save for his presence. "Enough," Samuel said. His voice was low, but it carried. "You've thrown chains, fire, mobs, and lies. None of it stood. You stand alone now, Morrison." The rancher's face twisted, spittle flying. "Alone? I've got this whole town behind me?" He swung his pistol in a wide arc, but the crowd only stepped further back. Faces that had once jeered were now tight with fear, or worse, with shame. Henry Talbot's voice rang out, clear and firm. "No, Morrison, you've lost this town." He stepped forward, rifle in hand. Beside him came Wilkins the storekeeper and Mrs. Green's eldest son, faces set hard. Others shifted too. Neighbors. Samuel had mended fences for, children he had carved toys for, mothers who remembered the boy he had carried from fire. One by one they stood straighter, not rushing forward but no longer hiding. Morrison's rage boiled over. He cocked his revolver and aimed square at Samuel. "Then I'll end him myself." The square stilled. Clara's breath caught. For a heartbeat, she thought the world would stop. Then Samuel spoke, calm as ever. "If killing me makes you whole, then do it. But know this, every man, woman, and child here will see what you are. Not law, not justice, just greeted with a gun." Morrison's hand trembled. Fury burned in his eyes, but the weight of the crowd pressed heavier. Even Blackwood faltered, his booming voice shriveling when no chorus rose behind him. Clara's hand closed around the colt in her basket. She stepped forward, raising it with both hands. Her voice rang out, sharp as iron. "You fire that gun, Morrison, and you'll meet mine before the smoke clears." Gasps rippled. The square seemed to hold its breath. Morrison's eyes darted, at sea. Samuel, calm and unflinching. At Clara, Colt steady in her grip. At the crowd, watching, judging, no longer willing to follow. His sneer cracked, teeth clenched against the truth pressing in from all sides. He spat into the dust. "You'll regret this, widow, both of you." Then, with a curse, he lowered the pistol, holstered it, and shoved past the crowd, his stallions, hooves striking sparks as he rode hard out of town. Silence lingered in his wake. Then slowly, one man clapped Samuel's shoulder, another tipped his hat to Clara. And then, from somewhere near the back, a child's voice called out, "Pa!" Not to Samuel, not truly, but the word hung in the air, a symbol of belonging. Clara felt her chest tighten with something fierce and tender. Samuel stood beside her, his stillness radiating strength, and for the first time, she believed Dry Creek might finally turn the page. Blackwood slunk away, muttering scripture that no one echoed. The square returned to its bustle, but with glances that carried new weight, respect, perhaps even admiration. As Samuel and Clara mounted their wagon, Clara whispered, "We stood in the open, and we did not fall." Samuel's gaze met hers, quiet, certain. Truth never does. The town did not cheer, but it did not turn away either. The days after the showdown carried a strange stillness. Dry Creek, once loud with gossip, walked more softly. Morrison had vanished to his far range, and though his name still hissed, in whispers, his shadow no longer fell so heavy across the square. Reverend Blackwood's sermons grew thinner too, his voice booming as always, but his pews less full. Folks had seen too much in the light of day. At the Whitford Ranch, the rhythm of life returned. Samuel mended the barn where fire had blackened the boards, his hammer echoing across the yard. Clara carried water, baked bread, and stitched shirts that now bore the rough wear of steady work. Yet beneath the ordinary beat, something deeper hummed, a sense that they were no longer alone against the tide. Neighbors stopped by more often. Henry Talbot brought seed potatoes and lingered on the porch, tipping his hat to Samuel as though to a partner, not a hired hand. Mrs. Green's son arrived with a broken plow blade and asked Samuel to mend it. "Strong hands like yours, reckon? They can set iron straight." Old Wilkins sent coffee beans, grumbling that a man who saves barns and boys deserves more than dust for his cup. Clara noticed it most in the children. They came without fear now, chasing calves by the fence. Eyes bright when Samuel handed them small carvings, birds, ponies, a wolf with watchful eyes. Their laughter rang across the fields, filling the spaces where once only coyotes had called. One evening, as the sun bled red over the horizon, Clara set the colt back on the mantel beside the arrowhead and the hawk. She lingered there, her fingers brushing the cool metal, before turning to Samuel at the table. "Do you ever think," she asked quietly, "that maybe we've already built something worth more than this land?" He looked at her, eyes deep as the earth itself. "This land holds what we build, but what lasts is trust." Her heart caught, the truth of it striking harder than any sermon. She sat across from him, their hands brushing as she set bread on the table. Neither pulled away. That night, as the fire burned low, Samuel spoke again, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "When the mob came, I thought I would die here, and I was ready. But then you stood with me. Not behind. Not only beside, with me. No one has ever done that." Clara swallowed hard, her eyes stinging. "You deserved someone to stand with you, Samuel. We both did." The silence that followed was warm, not heavy. It stretched between them like a quilt, stitched with trust, grief, and something tender, neither dared name yet. The next morning, Clara woke to laughter outside. A boy was perched on the fence rail, Samuel holding him steady while showing him how to balance a carved hawk on his hand. Clara stood at the window, watching, her chest full. The boy's mother called from the road, smiling shyly instead of pulling her son away. Slowly, Dry Creek was changing. Later that evening, after supper, Samuel brought in another carving, this one different. A small house, rough-hewn but sturdy, its roof peaked, its door wide. He set it on the table, his expression unreadable. Clara touched it, tracing the lines with her fingers. "What's this?" "A home," he said simply. "Not mine, not yours. Ours, if you choose it." Her breath caught. She looked at him, really looked, and saw not the man the town had mocked or feared, but the man who had rebuilt her fences, carried her burdens, faced down fire and fury at her side. A man she had come to trust with more than her land, with her heart. She set her hand over his, firm, steady. "Then we'll build it. Together." The firelight glowed over the mantle, over the colt, the arrowhead, the hawk, and now the carved house. Tokens are no longer of survival alone, but of something lasting, of a family in the making. Some stories don't end with victory, they end with belonging. The season turned, the air shifting from the scorch of summer to the cooler hush of autumn. At the Whitford ranch, fields lay golden, cattle moved steadily, and the fences stood straighter than they had in years. Clara walked the rows with Samuel. At her side, the rhythm of their days no longer one of strangers but of partners. Neighbors came more freely now. Henry Talbot brought seed corn for spring. Mrs. Green's boy ran errands, eager for Samuel's lessons in carving. Even old Wilkins tipped his hat without grumble, muttering about honest folk doing honest work. The sharpest tongues of Dry Creek had dulled. Morrison's name was spoken only in whispers, his threats hollow without followers. And Reverend Blackwood still thundered, but his words fell thin against pews that emptied week by week. One evening, Clara and Samuel sat by the fire, their hands busy with simple tasks, her needle stitching, his knife shaping cedar. The tokens on the mantel gleamed in the lamplight, the colt, the arrowhead, the hawk, the small carved house. Each one is a piece of their journey, each one a story of survival turned into something greater. Clara set her sewing aside and looked at Samuel. "Do you ever think we might finally have peace?" He met her gaze, steady and sure. "Peace is not given. It's built. And we've begun." Her throat tightened, her chest swelling with something fierce and tender. She reached for his hand, and this time he did not hesitate. Their fingers twined, rough from work, but warm with promise. In that quiet, she felt the truth. They had not just survived Dry Creek. They had changed it, not through sermons or laws, but through grit, mercy, and the simple, unshaken choice to stand together. Weeks later, the town gathered for a harvest supper. Lanterns lit the square, fiddles played, and children darted between tables. Clara and Samuel stood at the edge, side by side. Eyes turned toward them, but no longer with suspicion. This time, there were nods, smiles, even hands extended in greeting. Mr. Talbot raised a cup. To neighbors who stand when standing costs the most. The crowd echoed, voices rising, and for the first time, Clara felt Dry Creek's welcome fall, not just on her shoulders, but on Samuel's as well. As the music swelled, Samuel turned to her. "Will you dance?" Clara laughed softly, shaking her head. "I haven't danced in years." "Then tonight," he said, his voice gentle, "we begin again." He took her hand, leading her into the lantern glow. Their steps were uncertain at first, awkward, but soon the rhythm found them. Clara's heart raced, not with fear this time, but with joy. Around them, the town moved, alive with song and laughter, and for a moment the long shadows of fire and mobs seemed like a memory already fading. Later, back at the ranch, the night was quiet, save for the crackle of the hearth. Clara stood before the mantel, touching the arrowhead, then the colt, then the small carved house. She whispered, "We made it through." Samuel stood behind her, his presence solid and steady. "And now we build." They sat together by the fire, hands entwined, eyes fixed on the glowing coals. The future was uncertain, as all futures are, but the bond between them was not. It was forged in fire, tempered by trust, and sealed by choice. And so the tale of Dry Creek, of a widow who spent her last $70 and a man the town once called savage, became more than gossip. It became history, whispered in kitchens, told at harvest tables, carried on the wind like legend. Because in a land scarred by fire and fear, two souls had chosen something harder, braver, truer. They had chosen each other. The frontier was never won by guns alone, but by courage to stand, mercy to trust, and love strong enough to turn strangers into family. Remember their story, and let it remind you what can be built when fear is not the final word. If this story moved you, ride with us again. Share it, follow, and let the frontier's next tale find you by the firelight.